Are you serious? You're expecting me to sit here? I paid for first class. Find me another seat.
Sir, first class is completely full.
Then move her.
Sir, the woman you humiliated on flight for 47 just shut down your entire company. The voice on the phone sounded strained, almost breathless, but Richard Coleman barely heard the rest. His grip tightened around the edge of the polished conference table as dozens of eyes turned toward him. 24 hours earlier, none of this seemed possible. 24 hours earlier, he had been exactly where he believed he belonged, at the top of the world. The private lounge at Charlotte Douglas International Airport shimmered beneath soft golden lighting. Expensive luggage rolled across marble floors. Business executives moved with quiet confidence. Richard Coleman stood near the boarding gate of Flight 447, adjusting the cuff of a tailored navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 56, he carried himself like a man who had never been told no. His company's logo appeared on skyscrapers across the southeast. Financial magazines called him a visionary. News anchors described him as self-made. Richard preferred a simpler word, winner. When the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, he glanced down at his first-class ticket and stepped forward with practiced certainty. He barely noticed the people around him. Most of them blurred together. Travelers. Employees. Background noise. The flight attendant at the gate smiled politely and scanned his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Coleman." Richard nodded and entered the aircraft. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and new leather. Soft overhead lighting reflected off silver trim lining the seats. He walked down the aisle toward seat 2A, already planning the calls he would make after landing in New York. A major acquisition was scheduled for the following morning. Reporters would be there. Investors would be there. Cameras would be there. Everything was moving exactly according to plan. Then he stopped. Someone was sitting beside his assigned seat. A black woman. Early 30s. Calm expression. Dark green blazer. A laptop rested neatly on the tray table in front of her. She looked up briefly as he approached, then returned to whatever document filled her screen. Richard's jaw tightened. For several seconds, he simply stared. Around them, passengers continued placing bags in overhead bins. A child laughed somewhere farther back in the cabin. The engines hummed softly beneath the floor. But Richard's attention remained fixed on the woman occupying seat 2B. "Excuse me," he said sharply to a nearby flight attendant. She approached with a professional smile. "How can I help you, sir?" Richard glanced toward the woman before lowering his voice, though not enough to avoid being heard. "I want another seat." The attendant blinked. "I'm sorry, sir." "Move me somewhere else." The woman beside him remained silent. Her fingers continued moving across the keyboard. The attendant checked her tablet. "Unfortunately, first class is completely booked today." Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. Several nearby passengers began paying attention. "Then move her." The words hung in the air. The flight attendant's smile disappeared. Even the woman's hands paused briefly above the keyboard. For a moment, nobody spoke. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. The kind of silence that appears before a storm. Richard crossed his arms. "I'm not sitting there." The woman finally looked up. Her eyes met his for less than a second. There was no anger in them. No embarrassment. No fear. Just a calm expression that somehow irritated him even more. She simply closed her laptop halfway and waited. And in that moment, Richard Coleman had no idea that the quiet woman sitting beside seat 2B would become the last person he should have underestimated. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, but the atmosphere around seat 2A had shifted in a way no one could ignore. Richard Coleman remained standing in the aisle, arms still crossed, his expression tightening with each passing second. He was not used to delays, especially not ones caused by something as simple as seating arrangements. The woman beside him had already returned to her laptop, her posture calm, her focus unbroken, as if his presence was no more significant than background noise. That silence bothered him more than any argument would have. The flight attendant cleared her throat gently, trying to maintain professionalism. "Sir, as I mentioned, the cabin is fully booked. There are no alternative seats available in first class at this time." Richard glanced around the cabin as if expecting someone to correct the situation. Other passengers were watching now, carefully pretending not to watch. A man 2 rows back lowered his newspaper slightly. A woman near the window adjusted her headphones but did not press play. Richard exhaled, then leaned slightly closer to the attendant. "Do you understand who I am?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. The question lingered in the air longer than he intended. The attendant did not respond immediately, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, sir. I recognize your name. However, all passengers must remain in their assigned seats unless there is an operational need." Richard's jaw tightened again. He shifted his gaze back toward the woman seated beside him. She had not reacted at all to the exchange. No glance. No expression. Just steady focus on the glowing screen in front of her. Something about that unsettled him. It was not defiance. It was absence of concern. He finally stepped into the empty space beside her seat and lowered himself down, though the movement carried reluctance rather than acceptance. He adjusted his jacket, then placed his briefcase beneath the seat in front of him with controlled precision. The flight attendant offered a polite nod and moved down the aisle, tension still lingering in her shoulders. For a brief moment, only the hum of the aircraft filled the space between them. Richard sat rigid, staring forward. He refused to acknowledge her presence directly, as if ignoring it could restore order to the situation. The woman finally closed her laptop fully and placed it on the tray table. She folded her hands lightly on top of it, then looked forward rather than at him. "You did not have to make that request so loudly," she said calmly, her voice steady but not confrontational. Richard turned slightly, surprised that she had spoken at all. "Excuse me," he replied. She did not look at him yet. "I understand discomfort," she continued. "But there are ways to communicate without creating unnecessary attention." A faint, almost imperceptible shift moved across Richard's expression. He was not accustomed to being spoken to like this, especially not by someone he had already mentally dismissed. "I was not creating unnecessary attention," he said firmly. "I was addressing a seating issue." She finally turned her head toward him, just enough for her eyes to meet his again. "It was already addressed by the airline before you spoke," she replied. "You simply did not like the answer." The words landed cleanly, without aggression, but with enough precision to unsettle him. Richard looked away first, breaking eye contact as he adjusted his cufflinks again, a habitual gesture when he was losing control of a situation. Outside the window, the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. Ground crew members became smaller as the plane began to move. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of departure procedures. The woman reopened her laptop, but did not begin typing immediately. Instead, she paused, as if reconsidering something. "My name is Ava Johnson," she said after a moment, not waiting for permission to speak. Richard hesitated before responding. "Richard Coleman," he replied, though it was unnecessary. She nodded once, acknowledging the information without attachment. Then, "Mr. Coleman," she said quietly, "I hope this flight is uneventful for both of us." And with that, she returned her attention to the screen, leaving him once again with the unsettling feeling that nothing about this situation was as insignificant as he wanted it to be. The aircraft climbed steadily through a blanket of white clouds as the city below disappeared beneath the morning haze. Seatbelt signs remained illuminated, casting a soft amber glow across the first-class cabin. Richard Coleman stared at the financial reports on his tablet, but the numbers refused to hold his attention. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the woman sitting beside him. Ava Johnson worked quietly, her laptop open once again, lines of data moving across the screen in organized columns. She typed with calm precision, never rushing, never hesitating. The confidence in her movements. seemed strangely out of place to him. In his experience, people either tried to impress him or avoided him altogether. Ava did neither. Nearly 40 minutes into the flight, a flight attendant rolled a beverage cart through the aisle. Passengers accepted coffee, sparkling water, and orange juice while continuing conversations in hushed voices. Ava declined politely and returned to her work. Richard accepted black coffee and checked his phone. No signal yet. He frowned. Being disconnected always irritated him. Across the aisle, two executives were discussing a technology conference in Manhattan. One name surfaced repeatedly in their conversation: Novosphere Analytics. Richard recognized it immediately. The company had become one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms in the country. Investors talked about it constantly. Financial networks called it one of the most influential companies in artificial intelligence security. Richard had tried to arrange a meeting with one of their senior advisors months earlier but never received a response. The opportunity eventually slipped away. He glanced toward Ava again. Something on her screen caught his attention. A logo. Small. Barely visible. But familiar. Novosphere Analytics. Richard narrowed his eyes. Surely it was a coincidence. Ava noticed his gaze and calmly adjusted the angle of her screen. Not defensively. Simply professionally. The gesture somehow made him feel as though he had been the one caught doing something inappropriate. Several minutes passed before Richard finally spoke. "You work in technology." Ava looked up from the screen. "I do." "For Novosphere?" Her expression remained neutral. "Yes." Richard leaned back slightly. That answer surprised him more than he expected. "Interesting company." Ava nodded. "It is." "You are an engineer?" Richard asked. "Something like that." Her answer felt incomplete. Richard disliked incomplete answers. "That is a very large company." Ava closed one document and opened another. "It is." Again, short. Direct. Impossible to read. Richard studied her for a moment. "You do not say much, do you?" A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I usually listen first." The response lingered between them. Outside the window, sunlight reflected off the clouds in brilliant layers of gold and white. The cabin grew quieter as many passengers settled into work or sleep. Ava continued typing. Richard watched her fingers pause briefly before she opened a secure messaging application. A single notification appeared. She read it without changing expression. Then she typed 6 words. "Security vulnerability confirmed. Escalating review immediately." She pressed send and closed the message. Richard only caught a glimpse of it before the screen changed. It meant nothing to him at the time. Just another technical conversation from another technology employee. Yet somewhere deep in his instincts, a faint sense of unease emerged. He could not explain it. The feeling arrived quietly, like distant thunder beyond the horizon. Ava returned to her work. Richard returned to his reports. Neither of them knew that before the plane touched down in New York, events already set in motion would begin moving faster than either one could see. The cabin light shifted slightly as the aircraft began its gradual descent into clearer air above the Atlantic corridor. A soft announcement came through the overhead speakers, informing passengers that in-flight connectivity would soon be restored for limited use. The quiet hum of anticipation moved through the cabin as people reached for their phones and tablets. Richard Coleman barely noticed at first. He was still reviewing financial projections, his focus narrowed on numbers that usually gave him a sense of control. But that control was beginning to feel thinner, harder to hold onto. When the Wi-Fi indicator finally lit up on his tablet, notifications flooded in almost instantly. Emails, alerts, and messages stacked one after another in a rapid stream that made his expression tighten. He tapped once, then again, opening the first message from his executive assistant. The subject line was short and direct. Urgent market update. His eyes moved faster as he read. Novosphere Analytics had issued a public security statement confirming a newly discovered vulnerability affecting multiple enterprise clients. The news had already reached financial markets. Early reactions were unstable. Several institutional partners had paused active integrations pending review. Richard paused, rereading the line twice as if the meaning might change. Novosphere was not just any company in his orbit. It was tied indirectly through a series of enterprise infrastructure contracts that supported one of his company's newest digital property management platforms. The same platform that had been scheduled for a major investor demonstration within 48 hours. His grip on the tablet tightened slightly. Another notification appeared. A senior advisor from his firm requested immediate confirmation regarding exposure risk. Richard looked up instinctively, scanning the cabin as if the answer might be visible in the space around him. The woman beside him remained focused on her screen, her expression unchanged. Calm. Steady. Almost detached from the growing tension unfolding around them. Richard leaned slightly toward her without fully realizing it. "Did you know about this?" he asked, his voice lower now, less commanding than before. Ava did not look up immediately. She finished a line of code on her screen, then closed her laptop halfway before turning to him. "Yes," she said simply. The word carried no emotion. No pride. No hesitation. Richard studied her face, searching for anything that might indicate exaggeration or coincidence. "When?" he asked. "Before takeoff," she replied. He exhaled slowly, glancing down at his tablet again as more alerts continued to arrive. A second message from his executive team confirmed that Novosphere had already begun isolating affected systems. A third message stated that external audits were being prepared. Richard felt something unfamiliar forming beneath his thoughts. Not panic, not yet, but the early shape of uncertainty. "You said something earlier," he began carefully, "about confirming a vulnerability." Ava nodded once. "I submitted a report after identifying irregular behavior in a subsystem linked to enterprise access controls." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you were ignored?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window for a brief moment, where clouds stretched endlessly in soft layers beneath the aircraft. "It happens sometimes," she said finally. The simplicity of her response made it more unsettling. Around them, passengers were now fully engaged with their devices, unaware of the quiet shift occurring in the seat between them. Richard set his tablet down slowly, no longer interested in pretending he was in control of the situation. For the first time since boarding the flight, he looked at Ava without judgment, without assumption, only calculation. And for the first time, he realized that the woman he had dismissed hours earlier was no longer simply a passenger beside him. She was connected to something far larger than anything he had understood when the flight began. The aircraft continued its descent, and the cabin lights shifted again into a softer tone as the sky outside deepened into a pale gradient of blue and gray. Flight attendants moved through the aisle with a new sense of urgency, preparing the cabin for landing while quietly responding to a rising number of passenger notifications. Richard Coleman remained still in his seat, but the stillness no longer matched his mind. His tablet was now filled with alerts that had begun to merge into a single overwhelming stream of corporate instability. Novosphere Analytics had escalated its internal advisory status from precautionary review to active containment protocol. That single change in classification carried weight he understood immediately. It meant the situation was no longer theoretical. It was already in motion. Ava Johnson sat beside him, her posture unchanged, her attention divided between her laptop and the subtle vibrations of the aircraft adjusting altitude. Richard turned slightly toward her, his voice lower than before, less sharp and more controlled, though still carrying the instinct of authority. "You reported this before anyone else?" he asked. Ava did not respond immediately. She closed her laptop and placed it on the tray table with measured care. "I reported it when I detected abnormal access patterns in a secure data layer connected to external client integrations," she said calmly. Richard processed her words slowly. And you believe this is connected to what is happening now? Ava met his eyes briefly. I do not believe it. I confirmed it. The distinction between belief and confirmation settled heavily between them. Richard leaned back in his seat, his fingers briefly pressing against the bridge of his nose. For the first time during the flight, he was no longer thinking about schedules, meetings, or acquisitions. His attention had shifted entirely to consequences. The company he had tied part of his upcoming expansion strategy to was now unstable, and the instability was spreading faster than expected. He reopened his tablet. A live market tracker showed Novosphere's stock declining in real time. Analysts were already issuing preliminary assessments. One headline referenced potential exposure across multiple enterprise partnerships. Richard exhaled slowly. Across the aisle, a passenger gasped quietly while reading a financial news alert. Another passenger shook their head in disbelief. The ripple effect was no longer contained to corporate channels. Ava adjusted her seat slightly, turning her attention back to Richard for the first time in several minutes. Your company may not be directly responsible, she said, her tone steady, but your infrastructure relies on systems that interface with affected platforms. Richard looked at her, a subtle tension forming in his expression. You are saying we are exposed, he said. Ava nodded once. Yes. The simplicity of the answer removed any space for denial. Richard glanced out the window, where the horizon was now clearly visible as the aircraft leveled into its descent path toward New York airspace. Below, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, calm and indifferent to the unfolding complexity inside the cabin. He returned his attention to Ava. Why were you the one to find it? He asked. Ava paused for a moment before answering. Because I was assigned to audit the system after a previous anomaly was dismissed as non-critical. Richard absorbed that quietly. And you were ignored, he said again, this time not as a question but as recognition. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she simply said, I was not prioritized. The words carried no resentment, only fact. Richard looked down at his tablet again, then slowly powered it off. For the first time since boarding the flight, he was no longer interested in controlling the flow of information. The situation was already larger than his ability to manage it from a seat in first class. The aircraft's descent announcement echoed through the cabin, signaling final approach into John F. Kennedy International Airport. Around them, passengers began preparing for landing, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place in Seat 2A. Richard remained seated, but something fundamental in his posture had changed. He was no longer the man who had boarded the plane believing everything around him was within his influence. Now, beside him, sat the only person who had understood what he had missed before it was too late. The aircraft began its final approach into New York airspace as the cabin grew quieter, the earlier tension replaced by a heavy stillness that no one could fully name. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated, casting a steady amber glow across rows of passengers who were now fully aware that something significant was unfolding beyond their understanding. Richard Coleman sat rigidly in Seat 2A, his hands resting motionless on the armrests, his tablet now shut and placed away without explanation. For the first time in years, he was not reviewing data, contracts, or projections. He was simply waiting. Beside him, Ava Johnson remained composed, her gaze directed forward toward the dimming cabin lights and the faint reflection of clouds passing beneath the aircraft. There was no urgency in her expression, no visible reaction to the increasing weight of events unfolding in real time. That calmness unsettled Richard more than any update he had received so far. A flight attendant moved through the aisle reminding passengers to prepare for landing, but even her voice carried a subtle awareness that conversations were shifting across the cabin. Phones were still active, screens glowing softly, revealing headlines that were now spreading beyond corporate channels into public financial networks. Richard's executive team had sent another message, this one marked with high priority. Novosphere Analytics had confirmed the scope of the vulnerability was broader than initial estimates. Multiple enterprise integrations across affiliated companies were now under review, including external systems tied to infrastructure providers. Richard read the message twice without speaking. The implication was no longer abstract. It was direct. Ava turned slightly toward him as the aircraft adjusted its descent angle. "Your team has received the updated advisory," she said quietly. It was not a question. Richard nodded once. "Yes." "And they understand the exposure level?" she asked. Richard hesitated. "They are still assessing impact." Ava looked back toward the front of the cabin. "Assessment will not change the underlying architecture already in motion," she said calmly. Richard studied her for a moment, the reality of her words settling in layers rather than all at once. Outside the window, the lights of approaching aircraft corridors began to appear faintly through the haze. The city below was still out of view, but its presence was becoming undeniable. Richard finally spoke again. "If what you identified is accurate, then this extends beyond Novosphere." Ava nodded. "It does." The simplicity of her confirmation removed any remaining ambiguity. Richard leaned back slightly, exhaling as he processed the shift in scale. "How long have you known this could escalate?" he asked. Ava considered the question briefly. "Long enough to escalate internally before it reached external systems," she replied. "But not long enough for anyone to act on it before deployment cycles completed." Richard rubbed his hands together slowly, a rare gesture of uncertainty breaking through his controlled exterior. "And you escalated it before takeoff," he said, almost to himself. "Yes," Ava confirmed. The aircraft leveled slightly as it aligned with its descent path into John F. Kennedy International Airport. The cabin lights brightened subtly in preparation for landing procedures. Passengers began shifting in their seats, gathering belongings, checking messages, and preparing for arrival. Richard remained still. For the first time since boarding, he was no longer thinking about his company as an isolated entity. He was thinking about systems. Interconnected systems. Systems that did not recognize reputation, influence, or status once they reached a certain level of instability. Ava opened her laptop one final time. A single line of text appeared on the screen. She reviewed it briefly, then closed the device again. Richard noticed but did not ask. Instead, he watched the city begin to emerge beneath the clouds, its shape gradually forming in fragments of light and structure. New York was visible now, vast and indifferent. And somewhere within its networks, consequences were already unfolding beyond the reach of anyone still seated on the descending aircraft. The aircraft touched down smoothly onto the runway at John F. Kennedy International Airport, the faint vibration of landing gear rolling across concrete echoing through the cabin as passengers collectively shifted forward in their seats. Overhead compartments began to open one after another, and the soft noise of preparation filled the once quiet space. Richard Coleman remained seated for a moment longer than everyone else, his gaze fixed forward, unfocused, as if the act of landing had not yet fully registered in his mind. The past hour of descent had not brought clarity, only escalation. Beside him, Ava Johnson calmly gathered her belongings, placing her laptop into a slim black bag with deliberate precision. There was no sense of urgency in her movements, only completion. Richard finally reached for his own briefcase, but paused before lifting it. His phone had already begun vibrating repeatedly in his pocket, each notification carrying increasing weight. Financial updates, internal alerts, and executive escalations were now arriving in rapid succession. He did not need to open them to understand the message had shifted from warning to confirmation. Something had already happened on the ground while they were still in the air. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers began standing in staggered motion, retrieving bags, and adjusting jackets. The hum of conversation returned, but beneath it was a subtle tension. The kind that emerges when people sense disruption before fully understanding it. Richard turned slightly toward Ava as she stood. "You knew this would move faster than they could contain it," he said quietly. Ava paused briefly, holding her bag strap in place. "I knew the system would respond immediately once exposure was verified," she replied. Richard studied her for a moment, his expression no longer carrying the confidence he had boarded with. "And now?" he asked. Ava looked toward the aisle where passengers were slowly advancing toward the exit. Now it becomes visible, she said simply. The answer carried a weight that extended beyond technical language. It suggested inevitability rather than prediction. The aircraft door opened with a soft mechanical sound, and a rush of airport air entered the cabin. Ground staff began directing passengers forward. Richard followed the movement of people ahead of him but did not immediately stand. His phone vibrated again. He finally pulled it out. The screen displayed a single subject line from his executive team. Emergency board assembly initiated. All division heads required immediately. His grip tightened slightly around the device. Ava stepped into the aisle beside him. For the first time since the beginning of the flight, she did not immediately move ahead. She waited, just long enough for him to look at her. "You are going directly into this," Richard said, more as realization than question. Ava nodded once. "I already have been." Richard absorbed the statement. Around them, passengers continued exiting, unaware of the corporate gravity unfolding in parallel to their travel routine. The airport jet bridge became visible through the open door, a fixed path leading into a world that was already reacting to events set in motion before landing. Richard finally stood, adjusting his jacket with a slower motion than before. The authority he carried onto the plane was still present, but it no longer felt absolute. It felt conditional. Ava moved ahead first, stepping into the flow of passengers without hesitation. Richard followed a few steps behind, his eyes briefly lingering on her back as she walked toward the terminal. Somewhere in the distance, unseen from the aircraft door, the systems she had flagged were already forcing decisions across multiple organizations. And for the first time, Richard Coleman understood that what had begun as a seating disagreement in first class had already evolved into something far beyond his control, something that would now unfold in full view on the ground he was just beginning to reach. The terminal inside John F. Kennedy International Airport felt unusually crowded despite the normal flow of arriving passengers. Digital screens along the walls displayed updated travel notifications, but many of the smaller news panels had already begun shifting toward financial headlines that repeated across multiple networks. Richard Coleman walked a few steps behind Ava Johnson through the jet bridge, his expression restrained but visibly strained in a way that had not been present when the flight began. Every few seconds, his phone vibrated again, each alert confirming that the situation on the ground was accelerating faster than internal teams could stabilize. By the time they entered the main terminal corridor, the environment around them had changed from ordinary airport movement into something closer to organized urgency. People in suits moved with visible intent, speaking quickly into headsets, opening laptops while walking, and glancing repeatedly at live financial feeds. Richard slowed slightly as he read another message from his executive director. Multiple enterprise partners had suspended integrations pending emergency verification. 2 institutional investors had formally requested withdrawal timelines. The language was controlled, but the implications were unmistakable. Ava continued walking a few steps ahead before finally stopping near a quieter section of the terminal. She turned back toward Richard, maintaining the same calm expression she had carried throughout the entire flight. "This is the point where containment attempts begin," she said quietly. Richard exhaled through his nose, looking briefly away before returning his attention to her. "Containment," he repeated. "You are saying this cannot be reversed easily?" Ava did not hesitate. "I am saying it will not stop simply because it has been identified." Richard absorbed that without interruption. Around them, the airport continued functioning, but he could sense the separation between normal activity and the unseen corporate disruption unfolding in parallel systems. He opened his phone again, this time scrolling through a full internal briefing. The report outlined cascading system reviews across interconnected platforms tied to Novosphere infrastructure. Each layer revealed dependencies he had not previously considered relevant to his own company's operations. The more he read, the more the structure of his assumptions began to feel incomplete. Ava adjusted the strap of her bag and spoke again. "Your organization is not the origin point," she said, "but it is within the impact radius." Richard looked up sharply. "Impact radius," he echoed. Ava nodded once. That is the most accurate way to describe interconnected enterprise systems when one node fails verification integrity. The phrasing was technical, but the meaning was simple enough for Richard to understand. Exposure was no longer theoretical. It was distributed. A group of suited executives passed behind them speaking in urgent tones about emergency meetings and real-time risk modeling. Richard stepped slightly closer to Ava, lowering his voice. "When will I know the full extent?" he asked. Ava paused, then answered with measured certainty. "You will not receive a single moment of full extent. You will receive stages of confirmation as each system completes its audit cycle." Richard nodded slowly, processing the absence of closure in her explanation. That absence was itself the warning. He looked around the terminal again, noticing now how many screens had shifted toward financial tracking dashboards. Market indicators were already reacting in real time. Ava began walking again, this time toward the exit leading into ground transportation. Richard followed, no longer maintaining distance. As they moved through the corridor, he finally spoke again. "When I asked you to move seats," he said quietly, "I did not understand who you were." Ava did not look at him immediately. When she did, her expression remained unchanged. "That is correct," she replied. Richard hesitated, then added, "And now I am realizing I did not understand what I was sitting next to at all." Ava stopped near the exit doors, where daylight from outside spilled into the terminal in a pale, neutral glow. She turned slightly toward him. "Understanding is not required at the moment it begins," she said. "It is required at the moment it cannot be avoided." Richard stood still as the doors ahead of them opened automatically, revealing the constant motion of New York outside. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, he did not feel like the situation was something he could manage through position or influence. He felt like he had arrived too late to control what had already begun moving without him. 24 hours later, the skyline outside Richard Coleman's office looked exactly the same, yet nothing inside his world remained familiar. Rain drifted softly across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, blurring the towers beyond into silver silhouettes. The conference room that had once felt like a command center now felt strangely quiet. Several chairs sat empty. Screens that normally displayed growth projections now showed compliance reviews, audit schedules, and investor statements. Richard stood alone near the glass, holding a tablet that seemed to grow heavier with every update. The numbers told a story he could no longer ignore. Major partnerships had been suspended. Expansion plans had been frozen. Shareholders were demanding answers. The company he had spent decades building was not gone, but the certainty that had carried him for years had vanished. Across the city, in a modern office lined with soft white lighting and rows of engineers focused on their work, Ava Johnson reviewed the final reports from the incident response team. The vulnerability had been contained. The affected systems had been isolated. Long nights of analysis had produced solutions that would prevent larger failures from spreading further. Around her, colleagues moved with quiet purpose. Nobody celebrated. They simply did the work. Ava closed the final report and looked out the window. Far below, traffic flowed through the streets in endless streams of light. Her phone vibrated once. A message had arrived from an unfamiliar number. She opened it. Richard Coleman. The message was short. "Thank you for doing the right thing when others did not listen." Ava read it once and placed the phone back on her desk. Several minutes later, another message appeared. This one was even shorter. "I am sorry." She stared at the words for a moment before locking the screen. There was no anger in her expression. No satisfaction. No desire for revenge. The apology could not change what had happened. It could not erase assumptions, nor could it rewrite the choices made before understanding arrived. But it was honest, and sometimes honesty mattered more than timing. Later that evening, Richard left his office alone. No cameras waited outside. No assistants followed behind him. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks reflective beneath the glow of streetlights. As he walked through the city, he found himself thinking less about lost contracts and more about a single moment on an airplane. A moment he had almost forgotten. A seat. A glance. A judgment made before a conversation had even begun. Across town, Ava exited her building and stepped into the cool evening air. The wind moved gently between the towers, carrying the distant sounds of the city. She adjusted the strap of her bag and continued walking. People passed in both directions without recognizing her. She preferred it that way. The lights above reflected softly across the wet pavement as she disappeared into the flow of New York. Somewhere behind her, a man who once believed status revealed a person's value had finally learned otherwise. And somewhere ahead, a woman who never demanded recognition continued forward without looking back. The city remained loud, busy, and indifferent. Yet in the quiet space between two strangers who had shared a single flight, something important had changed. Not because one person won and another lost, but because truth had arrived before understanding, and understanding had arrived before it was too late. Beneath the glow of distant streetlights, the night carried on, and the silence left behind said everything words no longer needed to explain.